There is a phase in deep transformation that almost nobody understands while it is happening, because it does not feel like progress. It feels like silence. Not peace in the romantic sense, not dramatic stillness. A strange silence. The kind of silence where your inner world suddenly becomes quieter than it used to be. The emotional noise that once filled your days starts thinning out. The urgency you used to feel begins fading. Thoughts that once grabbed your attention with force now pass by with less intensity. And even the life you have been living can begin feeling oddly distant, as if something inside you is no longer fully participating in the same way. That silence can be deeply confusing, because most people are conditioned to believe that movement feels loud. They think transformation should come with excitement, certainty, signs, motivation, emotional momentum. They think if something big is happening, they should feel more activated, more inspired, more connected to a clear future. But many real timeline shifts begin in the exact opposite way. They begin when the noise starts disappearing. This is why people so often misread the early stage of a timeline shift. They interpret the silence as stagnation. They assume they are becoming disconnected, unmotivated, or emotionally flat. They think something is wrong because the old level of intensity is gone. But what if that silence is not absence? What if it is the first sign that the old reality is losing its hold on your nervous system? Because that is often what is really happening. Your timeline does not begin changing the moment your external life looks different. It begins changing the moment the observer inside you becomes different enough that the old reality can no longer feel fully coherent. That is why the silence comes first. The old self lived through noise. It lived through repeated emotional reactions, constant internal narration, urgency, overanalysis, anticipation, fear, desire, and survival-based meaning-making. That noise was not just background activity. It was one of the main ways the old identity kept the old timeline emotionally alive. The more the body repeated the same chemistry, the more the same world kept feeling real. Dr. Joe Dispenza often explains that the body becomes the mind of the past. That means your familiar emotional states stop being temporary responses and start becoming a baseline. Stress becomes familiar. Hypervigilance becomes familiar. Internal overactivity becomes familiar. The body learns how to feel the old life so repeatedly that it begins recreating it automatically. And that automatic recreation often sounds like noise. The mind predicting, the nervous system reacting, the old self interpreting everything through what it already knows. So when a timeline starts shifting, one of the earliest signs is that the old noise begins losing force. Not because you solved everything, because the old emotional architecture is no longer being fed in the same way. This can feel extremely strange if you are used to identifying with intensity. You may notice that things that once triggered immediate internal storms no longer have the same power. People who used to occupy your attention constantly begin feeling less emotionally central. Problems that once seemed enormous begin feeling like they belong to a life you are no longer fully fused with. And because the new timeline is not fully visible yet, the silence can feel disorienting. You are no longer fully inside the old reality, but you are not yet fully stabilized in the new one. That in-between state often feels like neutral territory. And neutral territory is one of the most sacred phases of transformation. Because neutrality is not emptiness. It is deactivation of the old pattern. The nervous system is no longer amplifying the same identity with the same chemistry. The old emotional meanings are no longer dominating every moment. The observer is stepping back from the noise that used to define reality. From the perspective of neuroscience, this makes sense. The brain is a predictive system. It builds models of the world based on repetition. The more you think, feel, and react in a certain way, the more those circuits become efficient. Over time, the brain stops asking whether the pattern is true or useful. It simply runs it because it is practiced. But when identity starts changing, those circuits begin weakening. That means the internal world often gets quieter before the external world visibly changes. The old loops lose their intensity. The old reactions lose their speed. The old narrative loses some of its authority. And from the perspective of quantum consciousness, this is even more significant. If reality emerges from a field of possibilities, and if the observer plays a role in collapsing those possibilities into experience, Then a quieter internal state means the observer is no longer feeding the same collapse pattern. The old timeline needed the old noise to keep itself emotionally real. Once that noise fades, the old structure begins losing coherence. That is why silence comes first. Not as a punishment, not as a void, as a sign that the old reality is no longer being held together in the same way. And if you do not understand this, you may try to escape the silence. You may try to reactivate old urgency, old goals, old emotional loops, just to feel familiar again. But if you do understand it, you start realizing something much deeper. The silence is not the problem. It is the signal. Because the moment the old noise stops running, your internal world is often the exact moment a new timeline begins organizing beneath the surface. And the deeper reason that silence feels so strange is because the brain is losing the emotional map it used to call home. The reason that silence feels so unfamiliar is because the brain has spent years using emotional intensity as orientation. Your nervous system learned who you were by what you repeatedly reacted to. What upset you, what pulled your attention, what activated fear, what created urgency, what made you feel alive through tension. All of that became part of the internal map your body used to navigate reality. Over time, the map became identity. That is why the old self does not just think a certain way. It feels a certain way. It expects life through a familiar emotional structure. It knows how to be anxious. It knows how to anticipate disappointment. It knows how to scan for what is wrong, what is missing, what might happen next. Even when those patterns are painful, they are familiar enough that the body begins treating them like stability. So when that internal noise begins fading, the nervous system can misinterpret the change. It can think, why do I feel so disconnected? Why do I care less? Why does everything feel quieter than it should? But what is actually happening is not disconnection from life. It is disconnection from the old emotional map. And that is a huge difference. Because the old map was never neutral. It was built from conditioned responses. The brain kept predicting life through the same loops, and those loops kept reinforcing the same timeline. That is how people can stay in one emotional reality for years, even while the details of their life keep changing. Different people, different opportunities, different environments, but the same internal structure. That is the power of identity-based perception. You do not only experience the world as it is, you experience it as your nervous system has been trained to interpret it. This is where neuroplasticity becomes the hidden engine of a timeline shift. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change its own wiring. It can weaken old pathways and strengthen new ones. But in order for that to happen, the old pathways have to lose emotional reinforcement. They have to stop firing with the same force. The body has to stop proving them true with the same chemistry. And when that begins, the internal world often becomes quieter. That quiet is not an empty phase where nothing is happening. It is a neurological transition. The old circuits are no longer dominating. The old reactions are no longer organizing the same reality. The old emotional habits are beginning to lose their power to define what feels real. This is why the silence can feel so strange. You are no longer living through the same level of internal prediction. The mind is not racing in the same way. The body is not amplifying every old fear with the same force. The emotional hooks that once made the old life feel immediate are loosening. At first, this can feel like being in between worlds. The past no longer feels completely alive. The future has not fully taken visible shape. The usual internal commentary has gone quieter. But the new direction is not yet obvious. This is the exact place where many people panic, because the old self interprets undefined space as danger. If the old map is fading, the mind wants to replace it immediately. It wants a new label, a new certainty, a new emotional anchor. It wants to know what to feel, what to chase, what to fear, what to become. But real timeline changes do not always begin with immediate clarity. Very often they begin with reduced noise. This is what makes the silence so sacred. It is the first moment the old reality is no longer being emotionally overfed. The old self is losing its automatic access to your attention. The body is beginning to feel what life is like without constantly rehearsing the past. And once that happens, A different order of reality starts becoming available. From the perspective of quantum consciousness, this matters deeply. If the observer participates in collapsing probabilities into experience, then a quieter observer is not just psychologically different, it is structurally different. It is no longer pouring the same emotional energy into the same field. It is no longer observing from the same past-conditioned urgency. And when observation changes, collapse changes. This is why a timeline shift often starts invisibly. The field begins reorganizing before the evidence appears. The observer begins changing before the life looks different. The old world begins losing emotional coherence before the new world becomes physically obvious. That is why the silence comes first. Because silence is what remains when the old self stops narrating everything with the same authority. And once that happens, another sign often follows. The old life doesn't just get quieter, it starts feeling less real. Once the silence settles in, another strange change often begins to happen. Your old life starts feeling less real, not invisible, not gone, just less emotionally believable. The same routines may still exist. The same people may still be present. The same external structures may still be around you, but they no longer land in your system the way they used to. What once felt urgent now feels distant. What once felt personal now feels strangely neutral. What once felt like the center of your reality begins looking more like a memory still happening in physical form. This is one of the most disorienting parts of a timeline shift. Because most people assume that if their external life has not changed yet, they should still feel emotionally bound to it in the same way. So when the emotional bond weakens before the visible shift arrives, the mind tries to interpret that gap as dysfunction. It says, "Why does this feel so flat now? Why does my old life seem so far away? Why am I here, but not fully here?" But this is not numbness. It is disengagement from the old field. The old reality stayed real because your nervous system kept reinforcing it. The same emotional reactions kept charging the same meanings. The same identity kept making the same world feel central. The old life did not only exist outside of you, it lived through your repeated emotional participation in it. That participation is what made it feel so solid. But when your frequency changes and the internal noise begins dissolving, the old emotional charge starts fading too. The thoughts that once defined your day no longer carry the same force. The situations that once felt heavy no longer hold the same psychological weight. The stories that once seemed unquestionable start sounding like scripts you memorized a long time ago. This is where many people say, "I don't know why, but my old life doesn't feel like mine anymore." And that sentence matters, because it means the observer is no longer fully identifying with the same reality. From a neurological perspective, this is exactly what should happen when identity starts reorganizing. The brain is no longer reinforcing the same pattern with the same chemistry. The body is no longer rehearsing the same emotions with the same consistency. The familiar meaning-making loops are weakening. So the old life loses gravity, not because it instantly disappears, because it stops receiving the same level of internal confirmation. This is how timelines actually begin separating. The old one does not always collapse through visible destruction. Very often it fades through loss of emotional coherence. The structures may still be present physically, but they begin losing their ability to define you internally. The old world becomes less magnetic, less convincing, less alive. That is a major sign, because the old reality cannot stay dominant once the observer is no longer emotionally organized around it. From the perspective of quantum consciousness, this is where the process becomes even more powerful. If consciousness helps collapse possibilities into experience, then emotional coherence is part of what keeps a given reality stable. The old self used to keep selecting from one familiar set of probabilities because it kept returning to the same emotional baseline. It kept observing through the same lens. But now that lens is changing. The observer is no longer feeding the same field with the same identity. And because of that, the old reality starts feeling less real before the new one becomes fully visible. That in-between state can feel surreal. You are still touching the outline of your previous life, but you are no longer fully inhabiting it from the inside. You may look at the same environment and feel like it belongs to someone you were, not someone you are. You may hear the same conversations and feel like the emotional language no longer reaches you in the same way. You may even revisit an old goal and realize you no longer have the chemistry required to keep caring about it. That does not mean you are broken. It means your system is redistributing energy. Less energy to the old meaning, less energy to the old role, less energy to the old timeline. And as that happens, something else begins emerging quietly. A different life starts feeling possible. Not fully formed yet, but emotionally closer. A cleaner future, a more honest self. A reality that feels lighter, truer, and less dependent on the old internal noise. At first, you may only feel this in flashes. A moment of peace, a cleaner desire, a subtle intuition that you cannot go back even if you tried. These flashes matter because they show you where your energy is beginning to reorganize. The old reality is losing its emotional claim on you, and the new one is starting to gather coherence. This is why the silence must be trusted, because the silence is what allows the old world to stop feeling fully true. And once that happens, the next temptation usually appears, the temptation to recreate the old emotional. When the old life starts feeling less real, the next thing that usually happens is this. The mind tries to make the old reality feel emotionally important again. This is where many people interrupt the shift without realizing it. The silence arrived. The old reactions weakened. The old world stopped feeling fully convincing. And instead of recognizing that as progress, the mind interprets it as danger. It assumes that if the old reality no longer feels central, then something must be wrong. So it begins reaching backward. It reaches for old thoughts, old attachments, old urgency, old emotional intensity. Not because those things are aligned, because they are familiar. This is one of the most important things to understand about a timeline shift. The old self does not usually disappear in one clean moment. Very often it tries to rebuild itself right when it senses it is losing coherence. It wants to restore the old gravity of your life. It wants the old fears to feel real again. It wants the old meanings to recover their emotional weight. And that is why the silence phase can feel so deceptive. Because right after the noise fades, the old identity often tries one last time to prove that the old world still matters more than the emerging one. It may sound like, maybe nothing is changing. Maybe you're just numb. Maybe you should care more. Maybe you should go back to what felt intense. But what the mind calls intensity is often just the emotional chemistry of the past. Dr. Joe Dispenza speaks directly to this when he explains that the body becomes addicted to familiar emotions. If the body has rehearsed stress, longing, fear, control, and urgency long enough, then those states become chemically familiar. The nervous system may actually prefer the old emotional noise over the new coherence, simply because it knows how to live there. So when silence starts appearing, the body may not trust it. It may try to replace it. And when it tries to replace it, people often believe they are losing the shift when in reality, they are meeting the final resistance of the old self. This is why the frame matters so much. If you call the silence nothing, you will try to fill it. If you call it failure, you will panic inside it. If you call it the transition, you will protect it. That protection is everything. Because the old timeline survives through repeated emotional participation. The more you reactivate the old urgency, the more you give the old identity fresh energy. The more you feed old thoughts with fresh emotion, the more you let the old observer keep selecting the same reality. But if you do not rebuild the old intensity, something remarkable happens. The old reality keeps losing emotional mass. And when emotional mass decreases, collapse changes. From a quantum perspective, the observer is no longer selecting from the same field in the same way. The old self was emotionally entangled with certain outcomes, certain roles, certain fears. It kept those realities alive because it kept meeting them with repetition and meaning. But the emerging self is less entangled. It sees more. It reacts less. It does not need the same level of noise to feel real. That is why the old life begins fading emotionally before the new life becomes obvious physically. You are no longer giving the past the same permission to define the present. This is also where nervous system coherence becomes the deciding factor. If your system can stay regulated inside the silence, the new pattern gets stronger. If your system keeps demanding old intensity to feel oriented, The old pattern regains force. So the real question in this phase is not, why is everything so quiet? The real question is, can I trust the quiet long enough for the new reality to stabilize? Because the silence is not empty. It is the space where the old observer is losing authority. And once that authority weakens enough, something else begins to happen. The future starts feeling more believable than the past. And when the future starts feeling more believable than the past, that is when the shift becomes emotionally real. This is the moment many people never expect. They assume a timeline shift becomes real when the external evidence finally arrives, when the opportunity appears, when the relationship changes, when the money moves, when the visible world confirms the internal process. But the truth is, the new timeline becomes real much earlier than that. It becomes real the moment your nervous system stops treating the old life as home. That is the threshold. The old world may still exist physically, but it no longer feels like the truest thing in you. The old emotional patterns may still appear, but they no longer define your center. The old roles may still be available, but they no longer feel emotionally inevitable. And the more that happens, the more the future stops feeling abstract. It starts feeling like something you can already sense. Not fully see, not fully explain, but sense. And this is where the change becomes powerful. Because when the future becomes emotionally believable, your behavior changes naturally. You stop negotiating with the same old fears. You stop orienting your choices around the same old identity. You stop needing the same emotional proof from the old reality in order to feel stable. That changes the field around you. A new boundary becomes easier to hold. A cleaner choice becomes easier to make. A conversation you used to avoid becomes simple. A desire you once doubted starts feeling appropriate. These moments matter because decisions are how timelines become physical. The old self made old decisions because it was emotionally organized around old meanings. The new self begins making different decisions because the emotional center has shifted. The future is no longer being chosen from the same past conditioned state. This is what people often mistake as sudden change, but it is not sudden. It is the visible expression of a long internal reorganization. The silence weakened the old noise. The old life lost emotional gravity. The mind tried to rebuild the past. You stayed with the transition. And now the future feels more emotionally true than what used to define you. That is the moment where a timeline starts gathering real momentum. Because the observer no longer just wants something new. The observer is becoming someone new. And that matters from both a neurological and a quantum perspective. Neurologically, repeated emotional coherence stabilizes new pathways. The brain starts selecting different interpretations. The body begins trusting different states, and the nervous system stops proving the same reality with the same chemistry. Quantumly, the observer is no longer collapsing life from the same emotional field. Different probabilities become available because the identity meeting them is no longer the same. This is why aligned reality often starts arriving with less force than the old life required. It does not always come with emotional fireworks. It often comes with relief. A quiet sense that you are no longer forcing what belongs to the past to keep feeling important. A growing recognition that what is coming feels cleaner than what is fading. A deeper knowing that you cannot fully go back, not because you are superior to who you were, but because the system is no longer wired to live there in the same way. That is how you know the silence mattered, not because it gave you immediate answers, because it removed the old emotional interference long enough for the new timeline to become believable. And once it becomes believable in the body, the last thing that matters is this: staying loyal to the self that the silence revealed. And that is the final devotion of this phase. Staying loyal to the self that the silence revealed. Because once the old noise fades, once the old life loses emotional gravity, once the future begins feeling more believable than the past, the most important thing is no longer recognizing the shift. It is sustaining it. The old self survived through repetition, repeated urgency, repeated fear, repeated emotional attachment to what was already known. That repetition made the old timeline feel solid. It made the old identity feel real. It made the old reality feel like the only place your nervous system knew how to live. Now the same law begins working in your favor. If you keep returning to coherence, coherence becomes identity. If you keep returning to stillness, stillness becomes safety. If you keep returning to the quieter self that no longer needs old intensity to feel alive, that self becomes the observer your life organizes around. This is why the silence was never empty. It was training. Training your nervous system to stop requiring chaos to feel normal. Training your body to survive without the chemistry of the past. Training your mind to stop interpreting every pause as failure and every unknown as threat. And once that training stabilizes, something profound happens. The old timeline stops having access to you in the same way. The same thoughts may still visit, but they do not define you. The same circumstances may still appear, but they do not organize you. The same fears may still whisper, but they no longer decide what comes next. That is real freedom. Not the absence of old echoes, the absence of their authority. Joe Dispenza points to this repeatedly. The body must stop being the mind of the past. And this is exactly what the strange silence has been doing. It has been loosening the body's addiction to the old emotional field. It has been interrupting the old narrative before it could fully form. It has been reducing the internal noise that used to keep the same reality emotionally alive. That is why your old life stopped making sense. That is why things became quiet. That is why the future started feeling more honest than the past. Not because you disappeared, because the old observer stopped being the center. And once the observer changes, reality follows, not always instantly, but structurally, inevitably. A different observer notices different possibilities. A different observer makes different choices. A different observer stops collapsing the same emotional world into every moment. The field around you begins responding with more clarity because the one meeting it is no longer fractured in the same way. That is the deeper meaning of a timeline shift, not escape. Reorganization around a truer state of self. This is exactly why I created Quantum Rebirth, not as another piece of inspiration, but as a structure for stabilizing this identity shift in the place where it actually matters, the nervous system, the emotional baseline, the observer that keeps selecting your life forward. Because insight opens the door, but repetition is what makes the new self real enough for the old timeline to finally lose its grip. And the quantum grimoire exists to help anchor that every day, to make coherence repeatable, to help stillness become trustworthy, and to support the self that is emerging until it no longer feels fragile or temporary. You'll find both in the pinned comment. Not because something outside of you is going to save you, but because what is emerging inside you deserves enough support to become permanent. So if life has gone quiet, if the old reality feels less convincing, if something in you knows the future is closer than it looks, even though it hasn't fully arrived yet, trust the silence. Because the silence is not what happens when nothing is changing. It is what happens when the old world stops speaking loudly enough to keep you inside it. And if you stay loyal to the self that can hear truth without noise, there will come a moment when the reality that once felt far away no longer feels far at all. It will feel like the most natural thing in the world. Because by then, it won't just be your future, it will already be your frequency.